Are you ready to take your career to a whole new level? PLS Classes can help you get there. A resource designed to empower and advance educators. PLS Classes offers online, on-site, and remote courses that will elevate your professional expertise. By enrolling in a course through one of our accredited college partners, you will learn research-based strategies that you can apply in the classroom. To learn more, visit plsclasses.com today. Your future awaits.
Hello, and welcome to the teacher edition of the Steve Barkley Ponders Out Loud podcast. The complexity of teaching is both challenging and rewarding, and my curiosity is piqued whenever I explore with teachers the multiple pathways for facilitating student engagement in the exciting world of learning. This podcast looks to serve teachers as they motivate, coach, and support their learners. Can I do less grading? I've been interested in the concept of grading ever since I saw the research that showed that teachers' feedback on graded papers had the same impact on learning as graded papers with no comments. I broke my heart every time I shared that research, especially when I had some secondary English teachers in the audience who I knew had spent hours. What the research showed was that students getting comments on their work when it wasn't graded had a tendency to impact student learning and improved future work. Once a paper was graded, the grade tended to disconnect the student from the feedback the teacher had provided. I'm going to be sharing some information from several different resources in this podcast, and I'll just say up front that you'll be able to find all of those in the lead into to the podcast. Alfie Kohn published an article over 10 years ago titled "The Case Against Gradings." It was published in Educational Leadership. At that time, he drew these three conclusions from his look at the research. 1, grades tend to diminish students' interest in whatever they're learning. A grading orientation and a learning orientation have been shown to be inversely related. In every study, the impact on intrinsic motivation of receiving grades or instructions that emphasize the importance of getting good grades has found a negative effect. 2, grades create a preference for the easiest possible task. With the focus on grades, students will likely avoid taking any unnecessary intellectual risk. They'll choose a shorter book or a project on a familiar topic in order to minimize the chance of doing poorly, not because they're unmotivated, but because they're rational. They're responding to adults who, by telling them that the goal is to get a good mark, have sent a message that success matters more than learning. And the third conclusion he drew, grades tend to reduce the quality of student thinking. They may skim books for what they'll need to know. They're less likely to wonder and say, how can we be sure that's true, than to ask, is this going to be on the test? In one experiment, students told that they'd be graded on how well they learned a social studies lesson, had more trouble understanding the main point of the text than did students who were told that no grades would be involved. Even on a measure of rote recall, the graded group remembered fewer facts weeks later than the non-graded group. Let me jump to a very current workshop presentation by Jesse Stommel titled Ungrading, an Introduction. He made these statements. Grades are not a good incentive. Grades are not good feedback. Grades encourage competition over collaboration. Grades are not good markers of learning. Grades don't reflect on the idiosyncratic, subjective, emotional characteristics of learning. And lastly, grades aren't fair. In Alfie Kohn's earlier piece, he stated that there were indicators that the work of non-grading, which was happening in some elementaries and middle schools, could eventually work its way into the high school setting. Metha, writing for Kaplan in 2022, reinforced those earlier comments of Alfie Kohn. Quote, "There is an increasing awareness that we need a wider variety of ways to assess learning. For instance, a number of colleges, including big state systems like the University of California and high-status privates like Harvard, have moved to make the SAT optional. Assessments should be grounded in the process and performance of work in particular domains and should be used primarily as a tool for inquiry rather than a single summative judgment. Exhibitions allow students to show fellow students, parents, and community stakeholders the value of the work they've been doing in school. Portfolios allow students to curate their work and revise their best pieces and align the way that they are being evaluated with the highest standards in a given field. The Mastery Transcript Consortium allows students to move away from conventional grades and represents their competency levels in various domains in the college admissions process. There is no shortage of the possibilities for different forms of assessment. What we need is the will to subtract existing low-level multiple-choice assessments to make room for these thicker ways of evaluating learning. I had the earlier opportunity to record a podcast with Tom Schimmer, the author of Grading from Inside Out. Listen in on Tom's comments regarding modernizing assessment and grading. So, Tom, in looking at the term of modernizing grading and assessment, I'm wondering what you would identify as some of the components where you might say that our doing isn't currently aligned with our knowing.
Well, I think generally speaking, I think there are probably three areas that come to mind immediately. First being the use of formative assessment. I think it's fairly ubiquitous that people understand the concept of formative assessment, but in far too many places, and I wouldn't say it's the majority, but I would say in far too many places, formative assessment is still about gathering information that doesn't count toward a student's grade, where the real power in formative assessment is actually using the assessments formatively. In other words, making instructional decisions, being able to see assessment as more a verb. So labeling something formative doesn't make it so. It's only formative when it's used formatively, and that means we take action, we make adjustments, we make decisions about intervention. So I think we're in a good place conceptually, but I still think that a more granular, day-to-day, ongoing approach to formative assessment that really makes assessment and instruction almost synonymous. There's a blurry line between the two. That would be one. The second area that came to mind immediately was in the area of feedback. I think we all understand the concept of descriptive feedback and how that can improve learning and how grades and scores can often interfere with a student's willingness to keep learning. But I do think we need to refine our approach to feedback, because sometimes it's not automatic that the existence of feedback will improve learning. In fact, there are many studies that show that feedback does not improve learning. And I think a lot of times that's the result of feedback that is really focused on helping kids do better on a task, but not really focused on impacting long-term learning. And so really focusing on the learning goals and having our feedback be a little bit more refined to impact long-term learning versus just doing, in layman's terms, we say doing better on a task. And of course, the third area continues to be the area of grading, where there's just an overwhelming amount of information right now that speaks to, and I think we talked about this last time a little bit, around the way that the percentage scale and the idea that there are 101 levels of performance and the whole notion of gradations of quality and rubrics. We have so much information, and yet grading has a grip. Traditional grading still has a grip on many schools and many individual teachers. So again, I can't suggest that it's the majority, but it's enough to be noticeable that traditional grading still has that grip on many schools and also many parents and students, and just looking at that traditional way that we've kind of sorted and ranked kids through that percentage system. I mean, there are probably others. I think that the fourth one that now comes to mind, I would say, is in the area of student self-assessment and peer assessment. I think we all understand the power of metacognition, but the idea of incorporating that into our classrooms, it's ironic in a way that teachers might say, I know how important self-assessment is and metacognition is, but I just don't have the time. When in fact, that is one of the most powerful strategies that we use. So it's interesting to say, I don't have time to utilize one of the most impactful instructional strategies because I'm too busy teaching, right? So there are four now. I mean, I identified that fourth one as I was thinking aloud here, and I'm sure there are others, but those are the first three and then four that kind of came to mind.
So let's take a look at some possibilities for things you might do to grade less. Jennifer Gonzales, writing in a blog titled 20 Ways to Cut Your Grading Time in Half, shared two that kind of jumped out at me. The first one that I saw, she called Pick One for Grading. And that aligned with things that I read other authors saying about engaging your students more in the grading conversation. In her idea about pick one for grading, she suggested that students keep work over a period of time in a folder, and then they select one of the pieces that best shows their progress and submit that single piece to be graded. That's certainly a great way to engage the students in that metacognitive process that Tom Schimmer mentioned. Another statement that Jennifer Gonzales shared that made a ton of sense to me was to begin describing the task that we give students as practice rather than as assignments. The word assignment suggests almost that it should be graded. But if you think about practice, kids know that all the time their athletic and performing arts coaches are assigning practice things to do. And while the coach might observe a student practicing and provide feedback on their practice, the coach certainly isn't, quote, grading, unquote, those practices. That sounds like a great start in my mind to get students into this concept of completing task for the learning rather than for the grade. And lastly, I found a website titled Teachers Going Gradeless. And I found a blog there written by Ed Vogel and Jolene Zywica titled Want to Go Gradeless, Here's How We Do It. And they described a process that as an alternative to grades on assignments, they use a 3-part feedback model that emphasizes both learning performance and skill growth. First, they describe giving students artifact feedback. That's feedback on their work products or artifacts, and that feedback comes from 4 different areas. The learning that's shown, the timeliness of it, the appropriate effort, and support from others. In addition, they have a skill checklist of 12 different learning skills that they give feedback on. And lastly, they give feedback on something they call engagement observations. They describe it this way: teachers observe in-class student engagement daily on a scale from low to high to identify challenges that might be preventing learning and growth. In their work, engagement is more than class participation. It includes how students prepare, focus, contribute, and invest in their learning. Here's the walkaways for me as I went through the materials that I've shared with you. I've definitely have been reinforced on the issue that the grades are frequently interfering with learning because it distracts the student to what the true end goal is. I know that working in some settings, such as when I taught graduate level courses for teachers for various colleges and universities, I have to, in some way, fulfill their existing grading requirement. But I love some of the things that I found here that support alternatives that would allow me to spend less of a focus on grading and a much stronger engagement in student conversation about the purposefulness of the work that we're doing and the student's own opportunity to analyze, often along with input from their peers and maybe even outside experts as to the level of learning that's occurring. I'd love to carry this conversation forward with you if you'd like. Feel free to contact me at barkleypd.com. Leave a comment or a question, and I'd get back to you. Have a great day, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening in, folks. I'd love to hear what you're pondering. You can find me on Twitter at Steve Barkley, or send me your questions and find my videos and blogs at barkleypd.com.